Hello, I'm Mark Lawson, president of MorningStar Music Publishers. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce a new Mass to you today. Joining me are three very distinguished guests: John Romeri from the Christ Cathedral in Los Angeles, California, composer Norman Gouin, and Kelly Dobbs-Mickus, who has worked extensively on this project. Welcome to you all. Glad that you could join us.
Glad to be here.
John, we're just going to jump right in with a little bit about tell us about the vision for this. I think the Mass is called the Mass of Transfiguration. You're the one that kind of initiated this. And so talk about your vision for this.
This Mass was used for our dedication, as you know, back in July. And so it was a very important piece for us because we're a multilingual congregation. And so the first decision was, do we have maybe Kyrie in Greek and a Samoan Gloria and a Vietnamese Holy Holy and a Lamb of God that's Spanish? Or do we take the chants of the church and make those into a Mass setting? All of our congregations at Christ Cathedral know the Latin setting. We use it a lot. Especially when we come together as a congregation, maybe on Thanksgiving or All Souls Day, or all the times we come together. It's what we have in common, and of course it's part of our church's heritage. So it was important for us to do that. This project, I guess, and Norm can fill in a little bit too, goes all the way back to 2010, when the translations of the new Missal came. And when those translations came out, it was the first time for the church to actually give us some melodies. And those melodies included some of these Gregorian melodies, some of the Eisel chants. And so Norm began to work on a setting called the Mass of Saints Peter and Paul, which you also published, for us at the cathedral in Philadelphia. So we've taken the chant parts out of that. We've expanded them. We've upgraded them, I guess we'd say, and added some more instrumentation, cleaned up little parts that we felt over the years. I think that's kind of been the hallmark of this series, is to test things out and to continually publish great music for the Catholic Church. And I applaud you for that, Mark. You've really been a champion at that. And Kelly for her incredible editing. But so that's where this came from. And so I went to Norm and I said, well, can we use your amazing Agnus Dei that half the country's already singing? And can we use the other chants? Can we do something with the Missa de Angelis Gloria? It's really almost sort of based on the Mass of Paul VI. He's the one that said, all these masses, all 18 Gregorian masses, are too difficult for people to engage. But there are certain ones along the way, Kyrie from Mass 16, the Gloria from Mass 8, and the Agnus Dei from Mass 18. So there were some pieces that the people could sing, and according to Pope Paul VI, should be singing. And so the new Missal and Norm sort of concurred and put that all together. And so we have this beautiful new Mass. Now, why the Transfiguration? We're Christ Cathedral. And so, as you can maybe see behind me, Christ Cathedral is the transformation of the old Crystal Cathedral. So we had to choose a Christological feast for our cathedral, and that's what we chose, the Feast of the Transfiguration, being transformed. And that's what we've tried to do at Christ Cathedral. And that's what this Mass certainly does, take these Gregorian melodies and transform them into something beautiful and new, while at the same time old.
It's great.
Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Norm, maybe you can talk now a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in setting basically Gregorian chant. It's
Sure.
not an easy thing to do. So tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, John mentioned that we began pieces of this, working on this project when the Revised Missal came out in 2010. And so, for example, I set the Agnus Dei from Mass 18. So one of the things I realized even over the years is I've always wanted to go back to that movement because I learned things in that movement, how the chant is sung, how the chant was performed by an assembly. And this gave me an opportunity to go back to that movement and rethink the metering and how I might be able to adapt the chant and the instrumentation so they worked better together. So I even learned through that movement over the years that I needed to rethink how I could take the chant, put it in a meter that made sense and was accessible for the choir, congregation, but also could be effective with a chamber orchestra, an instrumentation, so forth. I think in the latest project, the Massive Transfiguration, the biggest challenge has been, setting the chant so that the assembly can join in and can be supported by the choir, and instruments can come in with all of these mixed meters that need to be in place in order to maintain the integrity of the flow of the chant. And I think John would agree that was probably the biggest challenge is expanding these settings beyond their intention, which was simple chant, and expanding them to full orchestration in a way that all the parts and pieces can work together. Movements that were specific or that were really challenging were the Sanctus was the one movement that was most difficult with that. And part of the reason for that is that chant, though it's sung all over the world, is not sung the same way in different places. So determining how we would actually set the chant and how we would handle the meter to support the instrumentation was part of the challenge.
When you sing chant, there's this natural lift. But when you give it to an instrumentalist, they just plow right through. They just keep counting and keep playing. And so it was, how do you score that? How do you make that mark that's going to give them the idea that maybe they look up and the conductor brings them back in? It was a challenge. I initially thought, well, let's look to Duraflé. He did that whole wonderful requiem. That'll be easy. We'll see what he did. Well, he altered the chant, so it was very easy for him. Yep. Because no one was singing along. So that theory went out the window, but it was a difficult task, and Norm did it with just absolute brilliance. It was great.
Norm is a very conscientious composer that way. He's meticulous, extremely thoughtful, and also pretty flexible. So I'm sure it was great to work with him, John, on this whole project.
It always is.
Norm, maybe you could also talk a little bit about how you set the choral parts or some of the different ways that you use choral harmonies in the different movements.
Yeah, I mean, as I've done with other projects, I've always been, I was training Gregorian chant. Chant has always been, something, musical form that I've gone to arrange settings of communion antiphons and entrance antiphons, going to the original chants, but taking those chants and setting them to modern harmonies and modern arrangements. And so this kind of connection between the old and the new coming together. And that's how I approach this project as well, specifically in the harmonies. So taking these chants, which are modal in scale, and then adapting them by incorporating modern harmonizations. So use of 7 chords and 9 chords, minor 7, minor 9, first inversion chords in the harmonies and so forth. So I tried to expand the harmony beyond the suggestion of the modal scale, and found that exciting and enjoyable to be able to play with that. I think the movement that I found, I really found was really engaged with that was in the Gloria, and taking the choral sections and creating a polyphonic treatment of those sections, but a polyphonic treatment that incorporated modern harmonization.
Can I ask a quick question here in that regard? You know, John, particularly teaching the choir and instrumentalists is one thing, but involving the assembly is another. Did you find that that was harder for them to, how did you introduce this to them?
The good news was they knew their parts. So we didn't have to really, if they just do their bit. The Gloria is the most challenging, especially with our dear bishop and some of our clergy, to keep them out of the parts that aren't theirs. But, you know, because we use screens or even programs sometimes at big diocesan liturgies, we can make it clear by only using text and then using music notation when it's their turn. So we have our folks pretty well trained to just enjoy the harmonies when the choir is singing. It's an ancient practice of singing in alternation. You know, that the people of the assembly sings one. If you go to the Vatican, if you go anywhere in Europe, you hear that all the time. And then the choir takes up this glorious little part. Bartolucci for years did that at the Vatican with his choirs. But norm settings take on a wonderful new freshness. I think the movement that we get the most comments is the Gloria, because they just loves the harmonies. You know, and because it's not just a newly composed piece, but there are fragments and bits and hints of the chant all through. Sometimes it's a whole declaration of the actual melody. Other times it's little cascades of things, or the sopranos soar above. It's genius, and it's absolutely beautiful. Our people just love it.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the instrumentation, that so people know exactly what the setting has been arranged for. Norm, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we, in anticipation for the dedication, you know, John had a full orchestra, hired for the event. So that gave me the opportunity to score it for full brass, some woodwinds, percussion, and strings as well. So, you know, this was, I think that's what makes it also quite accessible, is that the mass setting can be done with organ, choir, cantor, assembly, as simple as that. And it can be done for these grand occasions with full orchestration, fully orchestrated movements. So the other thing that I found is because of oftentimes, especially like in the Gloria, the instruments will mirror the choral parts. It makes it very easy if you don't have those full resources. Let's say you just had an oboe or a flute, or just the brass, or just strings even. Those parts can kind of stand alone in conjunction with the organ and the choir. So it's quite flexible in terms of the resources that a community has. You know, whether they're celebrating Easter and they just want to use brass and percussion, the setting works with just that instrumentation, but then can be embellished for kind of a full chamber orchestra setup. So.
And in these days of coronavirus, we found out that it works very well with cantor and organ, you know, even though it's Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
And John, you recorded the full version, and I think we're going to link to that on our website so they can buy it directly from you all. Talk about that recording process.
Well, because Norm is such a meticulous composer, we have lots of versions of this. And so on this, because it's not a recording of the actual dedication, we recorded it all the way back in February. And so the Mass was still evolving. There's still some parts that were written after this recording. So on the recording, you can hear some movements with brass, some movements with just organ, with kids' choirs there. We've got lots of different ways, even on just that one recording, that you can hear the Mass in different versions. and our choir, it was wonderful because there were so many versions of like the Sanctus floating around. On the top of their copy, their little written copy, it says, use only this version. So that's the deal with these living composers. But, but it's just absolutely beautiful. And I think the recording, even though sort of early on, I had a couple of other occasions like this. We recorded all the papal music back in '99 that we commissioned, and the music was hot off the press. I can remember Leo Nestor, talking to me on the phone as I'm making the recording, saying, no, move this, change this note over here. And that's the joy of all of this. But so when you go back, you think, wow, we sang it so differently once we finally got to the event. But I think this Mass really, it's stunning on the recording, and it was magnificent in the actual dedication, that's for sure. Folks all over the country have been calling and asking, especially around Easter time and through Lent and things, really wanted this setting so badly. So I know everyone's going to be excited that it's finally published.
Thank you both for joining us for this, and I greatly appreciate it. And thank you, Kelly, for all of your hard work on this.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a great day.